Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a time when your dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a gamble with death. Forget the visions of royal feasts and extravagant banquets. Medieval Europe wasn't serving up roasted turkey legs and turkey-laden tables. Nope. Think mouldy bread, mystery meats, and whatever wasn't too rotten to stomach. No forks, no hygiene, and absolutely no idea if what you were eating was food or the disease that would kill you. And for the poor, it wasn't just bad, it was a nightmare. So if you've got snacks by your side, maybe think twice before you take another bite. Wonder how people actually survived this culinary nightmare? Well, stick around. Before we dig in, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? What time is it in your world right now? I'm always curious which time zones are crazy enough to tackle this topic at midnight. Now, let's dim the lights, take a deep breath, and get ready to sink your teeth into the worst menu in European history. In the early centuries of medieval Europe, the staple of every meal, whether in a royal castle or a humble peasant hut, was bread. But not the kind of bread we know today, soft, pillowy, and fresh from the oven. Instead, bread during this period was hard, stale, and often served as little more than a vessel for soup or stew. Why? To understand the fate of medieval food, we must first explore the realities of survival during this era. Throughout the Middle Ages, agricultural practices were inefficient at best. Most farming was done with primitive tools, and crop yields were low, with little to no margin for error. A single bad harvest could lead to famine. So, bread, made from wheat, rye or barley, became the basis of life, regardless of the quality of ingredients. But this isn't the worst of it. The bread often became stale quickly due to a lack of refrigeration, and the more ancient bread could have a sour, often mouldy taste. But despite these disadvantages, bread was a crucial part of life. It was used in every meal, soaking up the few watery stews peasants could afford, absorbing the little fat and protein they had available. What's even worse is that bread was often made with the same wheat and grains used to grow the next crop, meaning it was a continual cycle of crop-reliant diets with very little variety. And for the lower classes, their bread was more often than not filled with undesirable ingredients, such as chopped up peasants' remains, discarded grain, or grain that had been stored improperly and became infested with bugs. By the time this bread reached the table, it was far from appetizing. The question remains, how did people manage to live off such a bland, tasteless diet for centuries? As we continue our journey through the dismal world of medieval food, it becomes clear that bread was not just a meal, it was a lifeline. In fact, it was so vital to medieval society that its consumption affected everything from social structure to the survival of entire populations. Bread was life and often death. In towns and villages across Europe, bread served as a daily necessity. For the peasants, a slice of bread was a hard-earned prize after long hours of labour in the fields. It was eaten at every meal, soaked in soup or dipped in the thin stews that were the primary form of sustenance. This daily bread was cheap, though far from nutritious. However, it filled stomachs and provided the energy needed for work. But bread was also a mark of social status. Nobility and the wealthy would eat finer bread, made from the best wheat and often flavoured with spices. In contrast, the lower classes, those who worked the land, had to settle for bread made from darker grains like rye or barley, sometimes even mixed with chestnut flour. It wasn't uncommon for peasant bread to be filled with weeds, bark or other undesirable ingredients when food shortages or poor harvests occurred. One of the more striking aspects of this bread was the way it was prepared and stored. Bread wasn't baked every day. Instead, it was prepared in bulk, baked in large loaves, and then stored for weeks or even months at a time. The bread could become rock-hard, stale, and incredibly difficult to chew. The tougher the bread, the better it was for survival because it could withstand the passage of time and the elements. To soften the bread, medieval peasants had a special method. They would dip the hard loaves into soups or sauces, allowing the bread to absorb whatever little flavour could be mustered from the ingredients. It was not unusual for bread to be soaked in ale, making the meal a necessary but unpleasant combination of nourishment and endurance. But perhaps the most surprising fact about medieval bread is the use of bread soup. This dish consisted of old bread, usually stale and hard, that was dipped into a brothy soup made from vegetables or meat. The bread would soak up whatever liquid was available, making it the primary method of preserving food. It was a frugal way of utilising bread and soup, ensuring that no resources went to waste. However, this practice also meant that the bread lost any semblance of freshness or flavour, resulting in a taste that was nothing short of unpleasant. Peasants, with little access to vegetables, spices or fresh meats, had no choice but to rely on what they had, bread. For the rich, bread was a symbol of power and status, but for the poor, it was simply a matter of survival. This unappetizing form of sustenance was the primary food source for medieval society, from the smallest hamlet to the grandest castle. The most perplexing question remains: why did medieval society persist with this diet, accepting stale, mouldy bread as their main source of nutrition for so long? Was it a simple matter of lack of alternatives, or was there something deeper at play? After countless centuries of reliance on stale, hard bread, medieval Europe gradually moved toward a more varied and complex diet. But the legacy of this humble food staple cannot be overstated. It is said that the hardships endured by the medieval population led to a certain toughness and resilience, not just in the body but also in the psyche of the people. Bread, with all its unappetizing qualities, was what kept them alive through the harshest of times. Bread, though frequently bland and often unpleasant, symbolized endurance. The very idea of bread as a survival tool is fascinating. How something so simple, so seemingly unremarkable, could hold entire societies together for hundreds of years. Its presence on the table every day gave a sense of continuity and stability. Even during famines, bread was still a vital part of the diet, albeit with fewer nutrients. Even the worst of medieval bread was still bread, an unwavering constant amidst the uncertainty of medieval life. For centuries, bread was more than just food. It was a currency. There were taxes paid in bread, particularly in rural areas where grain was the most accessible form of trade. In some cases, entire armies were fed on bread, sometimes made from the poorest quality flour. Bread was also used in religious ceremonies. Christians in the medieval period were taught that bread was a symbol of life and divine providence, particularly in the form of communion, a tradition that, while spiritual, also echoed the importance of bread in daily life. Bread's role in sustaining populations goes beyond the medieval period, affecting the way society developed in subsequent centuries. Its significance laid the groundwork for the agricultural revolution, which would eventually lead to better farming techniques and the development of more diverse and nutritious diets. As more crops became available, such as potatoes and maize, bread recipes began to diversify. The hard, stale loaves of the past were replaced with lighter, softer and more palatable breads, though the simple loaves of the past still haunt the historical imagination. But still, even today, the legacy of medieval bread lives on. From the humble beginnings of wheat and barley loaves, we now have the variety of bread we see across the world today. But there is something haunting about the very idea of a food so foundational yet so unremarkable. The stale bread of medieval Europe, filled with the remnants of 1,000 years of struggle, paved the way for the global food culture we now enjoy, albeit without the same hardships. How much of the world's modern culinary traditions were influenced by the basic, often dreadful meal? In what ways does the survival instinct embedded in the medieval diet still resonate in today's global food practices? The story of medieval bread, with all its unappetizing history, reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. It wasn't just about the bread, but the people who survived on it. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. How history, no matter how dull or unappealing, has shaped the present in ways we often don't realize. The word fruit conjures up images of colourful, succulent apples, plump berries, and sweet peaches, foods we can easily find in grocery stores today. But in medieval Europe, fruit wasn't always as abundant or as delightful as we might think. The relationship between medieval society and fruit was complex, and most of the fruits that were common during this time are no longer part of our modern diet. To understand why fruits were so different back then, we need to look at the practicalities of medieval agriculture and the way it shaped the availability and consumption of fruits. Medieval fruit was often wild and unpredictable, grown more from necessity than enjoyment. Many of the fruits people ate were not the sweet, cultivated varieties we're used to today, but rather bitter, sour, or tough, often coming from trees that were wild or unsophisticatedly cultivated. There were no grocery store aisles filled with peaches, pineapples, and grapes. Instead, the fruits available to people were limited to apples, pears, plums, and cherries, many of which had a much more astringent taste than we experience today. Apples were the most common fruit, yet they were often not as sweet as the varieties we enjoy now. These apples were primarily grown for their preservation qualities, rather than their taste. They could be stored for long periods, making them an important food source through the colder months when fresh produce was scarce. Apples would be stewed, dried, or fermented into cider, most often used as a way to get some sweetness or flavour into the otherwise bland winter meals. But apples weren't the only fruit to make its way into the medieval diet. Pears and plums were also common, and these were often preserved by drying, much like apples. Pears in particular were used in cooking, often paired with game meats or in tarts. Plums, however, were more often fermented into alcohol. Prune wine was a specialty in some regions of Europe. This was not for the faint-hearted, as it was a potent drink, nothing like the sweet wines we are familiar with today. Fruit trees were often found in monasteries, which were key centres for agriculture and food production. The monks who grew these fruits often did so as part of a larger plan to feed themselves and their communities. Orchards were carefully tended, but they weren't just about producing food for the monks, they were also used to demonstrate divine providence and grace. Fruits were symbols of fertility and the natural world's ability to provide. For a monk, cultivating fruit was not only a task of survival, but also an act of reverence, a way of honouring God's creations. However, the fruits they grew were often rather bland in comparison to what we expect today, yet the cultivation and consumption of fruit weren't without challenges. The medieval diet was very dependent on seasonality, and fruits were no exception. In a world without refrigeration, once harvested, fruits had to be consumed quickly or preserved through drying, pickling, or fermenting. Fresh fruit was a rare luxury in winter months, and some fruits, like strawberries, simply couldn't survive the cold. But while most of the fruit consumed in medieval Europe was far from the sweet, juicy variety we're accustomed to, it was an essential part of their survival strategy. The question is, how did this limited variety of fruit evolve over time? And what role did it play in shaping the social and agricultural practices of the Middle Ages? The role of fruit in medieval Europe was not limited to being a mere food source. It was deeply intertwined with the practices of medieval medicine, preservation, and religious symbolism. Even though the fruits were not as flavourful or varied as we know today, their uses stretched far beyond the dining table. They were part of a larger, more holistic approach to health and survival, in a time when medicine was rudimentary at best and the natural world held profound significance. In medieval society, the distinction between food and medicine was far less clear-cut than it is today. Many fruits were believed to have medicinal properties and were often prescribed to treat a variety of ailments. Pears, for example, were known for their cooling properties and were often given to those suffering from fever or heat-related illnesses. The juice of the apple was also a common remedy for digestive problems, while plums were used to relieve constipation. Fruit was seen as both sustenance and a natural healing tool, often prescribed by monks or physicians who relied on natural remedies to treat everything from the common cold to more serious conditions. The preservation of fruit was also an art in itself. Medieval Europeans had no refrigeration, so they relied heavily on drying and fermenting to preserve fruits for the lean winter months. Apples, plums, and cherries were dried, often sliced and strung on ropes, or placed in baskets to be stored in cool, dry places. These dried fruits became an important part of the winter diet. added to porridge or stews to bring a bit of flavour and nutrition to otherwise bland meals. Fermentation was another crucial method of preservation. Many fruits were fermented into alcohol to keep them from spoiling. The most notable example is the making of cider from apples, which became a staple beverage, especially in Northern Europe. Fermented plums, pears, and even berries were turned into wines or meads. These alcoholic drinks not only provided some variety to the medieval diet, but were also essential in an age when clean drinking water was often hard to come by. The fermentation process helped kill harmful bacteria, making these drinks safer to consume than water from rivers or wells. But even beyond the practical considerations of food preservation and medicinal uses, fruit in the medieval period carried deep religious symbolism. The apple, for instance, was famously linked to the Garden of Eden and, by extension, to the fall of mankind. For Christians in the medieval period, fruit was a reminder of humanity's lost innocence. Many monasteries and abbeys cultivated orchards, and these fruit trees were not just a source of sustenance, they were seen as sacred. In many cases, the care and cultivation of fruit trees were part of the monks' devotion, symbolizing the cultivation of spiritual fruitfulness in their own lives. The importance of fruit in medieval society extended beyond practical needs to spiritual and cultural symbolism. But the limitations of available fruits meant that the medieval diet was much more austere than our modern one, relying on whatever fruits could survive the harsh climate and poor agricultural practices of the time. Even so, the medieval reliance on fruit for both food and medicine revealed a deep connection to nature, a relationship that would later influence the agricultural revolutions of the Renaissance and beyond. Yet despite the significance fruit held, it wasn't enough to sustain medieval society on its own. The question remains, how did the need for a more varied and nutritious diet push medieval Europeans to innovate and diversify their food practices in the centuries that followed? As medieval Europe slowly transitioned into the Renaissance period, the way people approached food began to change dramatically. One of the most important factors in this evolution was the advancement of agricultural practices, which led to better cultivation methods and the introduction of new, more diverse foods into the European diet. This period saw the beginnings of more sophisticated farming techniques, which in turn allowed for better fruit varieties to be cultivated, setting the stage for a broader array of flavours, textures, and nutrients. By the late medieval period, fruit cultivation began to shift from the wild, erratic varieties grown by monks and peasants to more intentional and controlled farming methods. The monks who had been the main cultivators of fruit started to experiment with different techniques of grafting and planting. This meant that fruit trees, like apples and pears, were no longer limited to the wild types, but could now be cultivated in a variety of forms. The ability to graft and cross-pollinate fruits led to better quality fruit that was not only sweeter, but more resistant to diseases and pests. For the first time in centuries, fruit trees were being planted for the express purpose of increasing the yield of edible fruit, rather than simply as a means of food preservation or medicinal use. This shift toward better fruit farming was particularly noticeable in regions with favourable climates, such as southern France and Spain and Italy. These areas saw an explosion of fruit varieties, and more importantly, the introduction of fruits that had been previously unknown to Europeans. One of the most important introductions during this time was the arrival of citrus fruits from the Middle East and North Africa. Through trade routes established during the Crusades, Mediterranean societies gained access to lemons, oranges, and limes. The bitter flavour of these fruits was initially unfamiliar to Europeans, but they soon became prized for their ability to help preserve food and their potential medicinal properties. Citrus fruits became symbolic of luxury, and their presence in the royal courts of Europe was a clear sign of wealth and refinement. Another key development was the rise of the fruit orchard as a business enterprise. Wealthier landowners, both in urban and rural areas, began to treat fruit cultivation as a serious agricultural pursuit. These orchards were no longer just a supplement to a diet of bread and ale. They became specialised in producing a variety of fruits, which could be sold at markets, transported over long distances, or even exported to other countries. The development of fruit trade in Europe had a profound effect on the diet of ordinary people, and for the first time in history, fruits like peaches, apricots and cherries were becoming more accessible, especially to the growing middle class. This new variety of fruit, alongside better farming methods, began to alter the diet of Europeans, bringing a shift in culinary practices. The more refined and diverse types of fruit cultivated in the Renaissance period began to appear in the royal courts, in the diets of the aristocracy, and eventually over time in the homes of ordinary people. Fruit began to be seen as something more than a survival food. It became a symbol of abundance and luxury. For example, sugar was used more frequently in the preparation of fruits, making jams, compotes and preserves more widespread. However, this shift was not universal. Even as fruit began to become more accessible in the late medieval period, it was still a relatively small part of the everyday diet for most peasants. Bread, dairy and meat still dominated the lower classes' meals, and fruit, while more plentiful, remained a luxury reserved for special occasions, festivals or feasts. By the early modern period, the fruit market had expanded to include an even greater diversity of fruits, and with it, a wider variety of diets. The cultivation of these fruits, combined with improved transportation and preservation techniques, set the stage for the globalization of food. The introduction of fruits like bananas, pineapples, and even exotic fruits from the Americas would revolutionize European diets in the centuries that followed. The days of bitter, astringent apples and pears were slowly becoming a distant memory as fruit began to find its place in the heart of European cuisine. Looking back, the evolution of fruit in Europe is not just a story of agriculture, it's a tale of innovation, trade, and adaptation. Medieval fruit may have been less sweet and more utilitarian, but it paved the way for the vast diversity of fruit we enjoy today. The ingenuity of medieval farmers and the exchange of goods across continents transformed fruit from a basic survival food into the delicious, varied component of modern diets. The question remains, however, how much of our modern food system, including the fruit we take for granted, can be traced back to those early experimental days of cultivation in medieval Europe? The fruits we eat today, from apples to citrus, have rich, layered histories, each one with its own story of survival, change, and cultural exchange. How did these fruits shape the global food market as we know it today? In the medieval period, a hearty bowl of soup or stew was often the highlight of a meal. These humble dishes, made from whatever ingredients could be gathered or scavenged, were not just filling, they were essential to the survival of the European population. Stews, broths, and soups were the backbone of medieval food, especially for the lower classes. But while they may seem simple, these meals held a deeper significance, both nutritionally and socially, and played a critical role in the survival of medieval Europe's population. The ingredients for these soups were as basic as the methods for preparing them. Most medieval stews consisted of a combination of grains, vegetables, and some form of protein. Meat, if available, was a luxury, and the poor often had to make do with bones, scraps, or salted fish. The core of the stew was usually a grain like barley, oats, or rye, which helped thicken the soup and make it more filling. These grains were cheap, widely available, and could be grown in abundance, making them the perfect staple for the medieval diet. Vegetables such as cabbage, leeks, onions, carrots, and peas were commonly used in these stews. These vegetables were often the only source of vitamins and minerals for the peasants, as they were relatively cheap to grow and were a great addition to soups that could simmer for hours. Legumes, particularly beans and lentils, were another common addition, providing the much-needed protein in a diet that lacked meat for the majority of the population. For the wealthy, the soups were a bit more elaborate, often containing beef mutton or game meats like venison, wild boar, or rabbit. However, even for the rich, soups were an essential part of the meal and were often served in large quantities to feed multiple guests. The rich would add spices, herbs, and sometimes a bit of wine to enhance the flavour, but the basic structure of the stew remained the same, a hearty, filling dish that could feed many people cheaply and efficiently. The simplicity of medieval soups was part of their genius. The long cooking times allowed the flavours to meld together, and even the most basic ingredients could be transformed into a flavourful, nutritious meal. But the importance of soup went beyond the kitchen. It had cultural and social significance too. In a society where food was often scarce, soup was a meal that could stretch to feed large families, and sometimes entire communities. It became a symbol of communal survival. Stews also had practical uses. They were often prepared in large cauldrons over an open fire, making them ideal for the medieval household. Leftovers could be stored for the next day, or even the day after, meaning that one large pot of stew could last for several meals. The pot would often be replenished throughout the day, with more water and ingredients added as needed. This made stews an efficient, low-maintenance meal for those living in difficult circumstances. The real question, however, is how did such a simple dish, so far removed from the fine dining we associate with food today, become the cornerstone of medieval life? Was it simply a matter of necessity, or did the humble stew hold some deeper significance in the medieval worldview? The reliance on stew and broth reveals much about the harsh realities of survival in the Middle Ages, and how creativity in the kitchen was a matter of life and death. As we continue to explore the crucial role of soup and stew in medieval Europe, it is essential to understand the more than just the sustenance it provided. Soup wasn't merely a meal, it was a way of life. In an era without antibiotics, refrigeration or modern medicine, broths and soups were vital for survival. These simple dishes provided more than just food. They were a means of staying healthy in an environment that was often hostile to human life. Broths and soups in medieval Europe were a cornerstone of the diet, particularly for the poor, for one key reason. They provided a concentrated source of nutrition in a world where food was scarce and access to fresh produce was limited. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was an ever-present concern, and the preservation of nutrients was paramount. Long-simmered soups allowed for the extraction of nutrients from bones, scraps of meat, vegetables, and grains that would otherwise go unused. For the medieval lower class, who were often unable to afford fresh meat or high-quality produce, broth became a crucial means of getting necessary nutrients. Bone broths, which were simmered for hours or even days, contained essential minerals like calcium and magnesium, which are vital for bone and overall health. Additionally, the slow simmering process allowed the collagen from bones and connective tissue to break down into gelatin, a substance that helped maintain skin and joint health. These broths were often consumed daily and helped maintain strength and endurance for long, grueling labour. Legumes like beans, lentils, and peas, when added to these broths, contributed much-needed protein for the body. While the meat in medieval diets was often tough, fatty, or rare, legumes offered a more consistent and affordable source of protein, and they were regularly included in soups. Peasants and lower classes often relied on these simple yet vital foods, as they could be grown easily in their own gardens and could stretch further than meat, feeding many people from a single pot. Herbs and spices too were commonly added to soups, not just for flavour, but also for medicinal purposes. In medieval times, the line between food and medicine was often blurred, and soups were often seen as healing elixirs. Garlic, onions, leeks, and mustard were common ingredients, as they were believed to have healing properties. Garlic in particular was considered a powerful remedy for a variety of ailments, from infections to digestive issues. Leeks and onions were thought to promote good health, and mustard was believed to aid in digestion and prevent the build-up of phlegm, a common problem in medieval society. For the nobility, soup served as a way to demonstrate wealth and sophistication, but it also held practical health benefits. Wealthier households would use more expensive meats and exotic spices, creating luxurious broths. But even for the rich, the benefits of broth were clear. Rich, meaty soups made from game meats or fish were often consumed as a way to recuperate from illnesses or to maintain strength during long hunts or military campaigns. Despite its humble nature, the medieval broth became an essential tool in the medieval quest for survival and health. It was a way to make use of every part of the animal, vegetable, orgy, or grain, ensuring that no part of the food went to waste. Broth could be stored for several days, ensuring that food was always on hand, even when fresh produce was unavailable. In a world where food security was never guaranteed, the ability to rely on a simple, nutritious dish like soup was a key component in the endurance of medieval societies. However, the widespread use of broth and soup begs the question, did the medieval reliance on such simple dishes reflect a broader trend in the period, one marked by scarcity and a lack of variety? Or was it a strategic response to a challenging environment? Was soup simply a necessity, or was there something more profound about the way these meals shaped medieval society? As we conclude our exploration of medieval soups and their role in the survival and sustenance of European society, it becomes clear that the legacy of these simple, hearty meals stretches far beyond the Middle Ages. The importance of soups, broths, and stews in medieval diets had profound effects on culinary practices in Europe and eventually the world. These meals, though humble and seemingly unremarkable, shaped not only the way food was prepared and consumed in the medieval period, but also left a lasting influence on the evolution of European cuisine. The medieval soup, in its most basic form, is still alive in many cultures today. Broths, stews, and soups have endured across centuries, passed down through generations, and transformed into the diverse array of soups we now enjoy worldwide. From the French onion soup to the British beef stew, and even the Italian minestrone, many of these dishes can trace their roots back to the types of meals that medieval Europeans ate for survival. In many ways, the medieval stew laid the groundwork for what we now think of as comfort food, a simple, nourishing dish that can feed a family or community. One of the most enduring legacies of medieval soups is the concept of utilising every part of an ingredient, whether it's meat, bones, vegetables, or grains. The practice of making the most of what you have became not just an economic necessity, but a cultural one. In today's world, where food waste is a growing concern, this practice continues to inspire modern chefs and home cooks alike. The idea of transforming leftover scraps into something delicious and nutritious is not only resourceful but also environmentally sustainable. This method of cooking can be seen in modern bone. Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a time when your dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a gamble with death.